term, Anglo-Norman, it simply means the English Normans, or simply the English. With their powerful armies, they conquered large parts of Ireland, and in order for them to hold on to and control these conquered lands, they began the process of building large stone military-style castles. Now, these early castles are what we all imagine a medieval castle should look like, because they had high walls and towers, drawbridge in front, so we even had moats around them, a little bit like what you would see in a Robin Hood movie. Now, there are some good examples of those early castles here in Ireland. Not very many, but there are some good examples. The nearest one to here is actually in Limerick City, King John's Castle in Limerick City. Other good examples are Cahir in County Tipperary, Kilkenny, Carrickfergus, right up in the north. And a very good example, if you would like to Google it, it's Trim Castle in County Meath, that's Trim, just north of Dublin. Trim was actually one of the oldest and the largest castle ever built in Ireland. It actually featured in the movie Braveheart with Mel Gibson, depending on you. More difficult to break it down using an axe, for example. Also heavily reinforced with all these rivets. And in those days, those would have been sharp and pointed, so you would not have done anything like this. The other defensive feature here, this would have been established probably about maybe 70 or 80 years after the castle was built. And that's because, of course, from about the early 1500s onwards, then guns and gunpowder began making their appearance in the Irish, in Irish conflict. As we go through the castle, the period in time, the time in history that we're speaking about, of course, starts at around 1450, when the castle was built by the local native clan, the O'Donoghus. And it extends to about 1580, roughly about 120 or 30 years, because in 1580, of course, the O'Donoghus lost the castle to the English. But a little bit more about that later in the tour. Now, in the meantime, this room is called the parlour. It was essentially the main living area for the chieftain and his family. It's where they would take their meals on a regular basis. Now, despite the fact that you probably had a large fire burning there for most of the time, because there was no shortage of firewood and it was heavily forested in those days. However, the food was not prepared for them here in this room. It would have been cooked in a little house just outside the tower wall, and the servants would bring it up and serve it here to the family. Now, the room also doubled as a bedroom, because there would be times when the chieftain would have a lot of people in the castle. Sometimes they were invited guests, but also during times of trouble or conflict, then of course a large number of people could be brought into the castle for their protection. Now, guests, or otherwise, all extra people slept on the floor. And just like today, it was a stone floor, but not smoothly finished with flagstones like it is now. It's finished that way now for safety reasons, so people wouldn't be tripping. But in those days, it would have been a lot rougher. And so, to make it more comfortable, they would cover it with a mixture of rushes and straw. And that was the practice in castles and houses at that time. Now, and it was all very well, except of course they wouldn't clean it out very often. So you can imagine with people walking on it and animals like cats and dogs roaming around the place, then of course after a short time it would become pretty manky and smelly. And they would eventually clean it out, but not very often again. Probably something similar to this one. Now, this particular bed is from the early 1600s, and it is a bit of a four-poster bed. Now, while the couple slept here, they had little in the way of privacy, no privacy, because also sharing the room were all their children, and perhaps 2 or 3 of the children's servants. And once again, both children and servants all slept on the floor. And there would be a lot of children, at least maybe 20, maybe more, maybe a lot more. And now the lady in the bed wasn't mom to all of them, as she may have been the chieftain's second wife, for example, other liaisons, and of course people died young in those days, so one of his wives may have died young. Very difficult to get past the age of 40 in those times. And now some people, of course, did live into what we now consider old age, but in those days, if you got past 40, you were doing very well. The entire castle had just one toilet, just one. It's actually just a narrow passageway here to the left. Now the human waste from the toilet would drop down a shaft to a pit at the base of the castle, actually just out there beyond the top wall. And there over time all of that would be allowed to gather and accumulate and collect until such time as it was probably overflowing. So then some servants would be designated to come along with their cart and their shovels to clean it out. Not a great career prospect, is it, girls? No. Now, all this time, of course, the gases from that pit would have been travelling back up the shaft, just like a chimney pulls smoke. And it, of course, it would fill the toilet area and probably here as well. As you probably guessed, that gas would not smell good. It would smell pretty awful. But it did serve a purpose because, of course, the gas was high in ammonia. And ammonia is actually very good for killing certain parasites, like fleas and lice. And they were a big problem in those days. So the family would actually hang their clothing, including bedclothes, on pegs along the wall in there. Close the door tightly, and given some time, the gas would kill the bugs. It would also kill you if you stayed in there for too long, if you were to fall asleep in there, for example. And so that was great, at least you were free of scratching for a while. The only downside was the clothes would smell terrible. But then again, in those days, that was not an issue because everybody smelled. No, people didn't wash very often. There was even a belief that too much washing was actually bad for you, that it would take away the natural oils from your skin and leave you prone to disease. So that kind of softened that problem out. Now, getting back briefly to the windows, and a question from this gentleman here as well. As you know, there was no glass in the windows. And now, if you look at the castle from the outside, you see all these stones that stick out under the windows, and sometimes people actually walk to the desk, and ask us what were they for. Were they for defensive purposes or something? Actually, no, they were purely for drainage. Now, the idea was that any rainwater blowing through the windows, it was channeled back out onto those dripstones, so that it would drip away from the walls and not cause further damage. And of course, that's largely due to the two big windows. Now, there would not have big windows like that further down the castle, of course, but they felt reasonably safe having them here at this level. Now, of course, they would have been further protected by heavy wooden reinforced shutters, should they need them. This is the Great Hall, and it's where the O'Donohues would have entertained their special guests. And of course, that would involve banquets. Now, like all good parties, there were three essential elements: alcohol, food, and music. Now, the food, a lot of meat, you'd beef, mutton, pork, venison, of course, with the wild deer, also fowl, like duck, and geese, and of course, this time of year, probably salmon as well. Also honey, milk, butter, all of those things. So the people at the top kind of ate pretty well, provided there was no wars or other disruption. Now, food for the banquet would have been cooked here. Meat, for example, would be roasted on a spit on the open fire, and then it would be taken to the little galley or kitchen area in there and prepared for serving out to the guests. Now, alcohol, pretty much like what we have today. Maybe not the same standard, but got you drunk, did the job. They had mead, which is made from fermented honey, probably the oldest drink in the world. Also ales, beer, whiskey, and of course wine. Now, just like today, wine had to be imported into Ireland, and in those days it normally came from Spain or France. Now, the music, of course, has always been part of Irish culture, and that is going way back in history, the art of storytelling, of poetry and music. And so the musicians and the storytellers, also known as bards, they would entertain the guests from the gallery here. That's called the minstrel gallery. Now, the chieftains being entertained here today, the old Gaelic chieftains, Irish chieftains. Now, their personal hygiene may not have been the best, but then again, in those days, nobody paid too much attention to their personal hygiene. But these often were quite cultured individuals, usually fairly well educated, because if you walk around Ireland in those days, you see a lot of castles, but you'd also see a lot of monasteries. And the chances are some of those monasteries might have been established by the chieftain's father or grandfather, and he was probably educated there. Often they were educated in classics such as Latin, and so all educated people throughout Europe would have spoken Latin, so if they met up, they could communicate. Now the various generations of the O'Donoghus would have lived in this castle for a period of approximately 130 years, right up to about 1580. But by 1580, things had changed dramatically. For a start, England was now a Protestant country. It became Protestant under Henry VIII. And it was all the time tightening its grip on Ireland. So basically, it wanted to anglify Ireland. In other words, to make it just like England and to make it loyal to the English crown. Now, in order to do that, it meant getting rid of the Gaelic culture, language, customs, and of course the Catholic religion. Now, there was an uprising against English rule in 1580, and one of many such uprisings, of course, throughout Irish history, but this one was led by the Earl of Desmond. Now, his name was Garrow Fitzgerald, and he was actually a direct descendant of the Anglo-Normans that invaded Ireland in 1169. But over the centuries, some of these powerful Anglo-Norman families had become quite Irish in their ways, culturally Irish. For example, they spoke the Irish language, adopted Irish customs, and of course they intermarried with the Irish as well. But their political loyalty was always to the English crown. However, in the late 1500s, that began to change in the case of the Fitzgeralds. They are now into conflict with the English crown. The rebellion of the uprising was against the forces of Elizabeth I of England, and the O'Donoghus also joined the uprising. But after less than 2 years, that uprising was crushed, and it was crushed pretty brutally. During the conflict, the last chieftain here, Rory O'Donoghue, and the last Earl of Desmond, both were killed. And following their defeat, then all of their lands and their properties, in the case of the Earl of Desmond, these were vast areas of land, they were confiscated by the English crown, and then redistributed to English nobility. Now, these English noblemen became known as undertakers, because they undertook to populate those lands with English settlers. Probably the best known of those would have been Sir Walter Raleigh. Another one of them was Sir Valentine Browne, and he was eventually granted possession of the castle here, which included, of course, the lake and all of the land surrounding. Now, that English family, the Browns, later they became known as Earls of Kenmare. They then lived in the castle, generations of them, for approximately another 100 years. They would have improved, of course, the living conditions in the castle. Finer furniture and things like that were introduced. Also, of course, a small mansion was built to the castle that doesn't exist anymore. However, by the early 1700s, then of course, wealthy, powerful landowning people, they no longer wanted to live in these type of surroundings. Like all rich people and like their peers, they now wanted to live in mansions. And so they built a mansion in what is now Killarney town. It's called Killarney House. You can visit there if you wish, it's open to the public. And so the castle was suddenly empty. However, it was here by the British Army. Now they built that barracks right onto the tower that I mentioned at the very beginning, and they maintained garrisons here until 1825, when they left for other barracks. Paying tax on it to the British Exchequer, the owners, the Brown family, took the roof off. Because if there was no roof in a building, you didn't have to pay tax. It's one way of avoiding paying tax, I suppose. However, the downside of all that, of course, was the castle over time became a ruin, and it remained a ruin until the 1970s. Now, very briefly, the castle's most recent history goes back to 1956, when the last of the Brown family, the last Earl of Kenmare, he passed away without an heir. And of course, the earldom, the line, died out. So the castle and the lands were sold by his niece to an American business consortium. Sometimes later, it was purchased by a wealthy Irish American called John McShane. Now, John McShane was a builder, a very prominent builder, He was involved in some very high-profile projects in the US, including the refurbishment of the White House, the building of the Jefferson Monument, and of course the building of the Pentagon, among many others. So he became owner of the castle, the lake, the lands, and also the mansion. Now he refurbished the mansion. He would live there with his wife and daughter on their many visits to Ireland. However, in the late 1970s, John McShane and his wife Mary gave all of it, the castle, the lands, the mansion, back to the Irish state, back to the Irish nation. Of course, was an act of generosity, exceptional generosity at that. And so restoration began in the 1970s. It took about 12 years or more to complete. Now, I'm not sure where you come from, but in this country, when governments get involved in projects, they sometimes go over budget and over time. However, a lot of work had to be done. For example, that roof had to be replaced. That's 20 tons of Irish oak, and it was replaced exactly as it would have been in the 1400s. There are no modern devices used, no brackets, screws, no bracings, nothing of that nature, just the pegs and dowels that would have been used in that era. It's covered in on the outside by Valentia slate, which comes from Valentia Ireland, down in the Ring of Kerry. The chandelier that you're looking at there, now the original was found in the rubble, but it was too far gone to put it on display. So they just made a copy of it, an exact copy, and that's what's hanging there. It's an exact copy. The candle, of course, would, just like in those days, would have been beeswax candle.